Welcome to A Slice with Dice, a podcast exploring the ideas, pressures, and possibilities shaping how we learn, lead, and grow. I'm Corey Alderdice. For over 20 years, my work has lived at the intersection of gifted education, leadership development, and school culture, supporting students as they find their strengths, educators as they stretch their thinking, and schools as they build pathways that expand opportunity. Ready to dive in? Here's this week's Slice. Over the course of this summer school series, College Before College, we've talked about the rapid expansion of dual enrollment in early college programs, the growing normalization of acceleration in American education, and the tension between accumulating credentials and experiencing meaningful learning. Now, originally, I intended this series to conclude with our last episode about the changing purpose of college itself. But while I was working on these episodes, I stumbled across a newly released research report from the Community College Research Center at Teachers College, Columbia University, that felt too relevant to ignore. And honestly, I think it pushes this conversation into an important next phase. The report is called Dual Enrollment Momentum Metrics, Leading Indicators for Program Improvement. And while that title certainly sounds highly technical, the underlying question is actually remarkably simple. If dual enrollment is now becoming a permanent fixture of American education, how do we know whether it is truly working? And that question matters because the first phase of the dual enrollment movement was largely about expansion. States wanted more students participating, schools wanted more opportunities available, families wanted more access to affordable college credit, and in many ways that expansion has succeeded. Participation rates have grown dramatically across the country over the past decade. But once a policy innovation becomes widespread, the conversation inevitably changes. At some point, systems stop asking whether something should exist and start asking how its success ought to be measured. And that's exactly where this new report enters the conversation. Now, the researchers examined dual enrollment data across 4 different states looking for what they call momentum metrics. And the basic idea is borrowed from community college research. Now, rather than wait 6 or 8 years to determine whether students ultimately graduate, researchers look for earlier indicators that strongly predict long-term success. In the context of dual enrollment, that study focused on 3 major categories. The first was credit momentum, simply how many dual enrollment credits students completed while in high school. The second involved gateway momentum, whether students successfully completed foundational college-level English and math courses. And the third category examined credential momentum, which is whether students earned certificates or associate degrees before graduating from high school. And what the researchers found was nuanced and, frankly, fascinating. Completing even a relatively small number of dual enrollment credits, as few as even 6 hours, strongly correlated with later college enrollment. Larger number of credits, particularly 15 or more hours, were associated with higher rates of college completion and faster pathways to bachelor's degrees. The study also found that gateway English courses appeared especially predictive of college enrollment, while gateway math completion was more strongly connected to eventual degree completion and shorter time to degree. But one of the most interesting findings involved certificates. In several states, students earning workforce-oriented credentials during high school were actually less likely to continue toward bachelor's degrees later on, often because they entered the workforce directly after graduation. Associate degrees, however, tended to show stronger, longer-term educational outcomes. Now, at one level, this all makes fairly perfect sense. Policymakers and institutions understandably want to know which experiences most reliably improve educational outcomes. If states are investing substantial public dollars into acceleration programs, well, they want evidence that those programs actually matter. And to be clear, I think much of this research is incredibly valuable. In fact, I would argue the researchers are trying to move the conversation in a healthier direction. Earlier discussions about dual enrollment often focused almost entirely on participation counts. More students enrolled automatically means success. But the newer framework at least attempts to ask deeper questions about persistence, momentum, completion, and long-term impact. But as I read the report, I kept finding myself drawn to a bigger tension within all of it. The moment educational systems begin defining success through measurable indicators, institutions inevitably begin reorganizing themselves around producing more of those indicators. Now, that's not necessarily malicious, it's simply how systems behave. If rankings reward selectivity, schools become more selective. If accountability systems reward test scores, schools prioritize test participation. And if policymakers decide that certain momentum metrics define educational success, then schools, colleges, and states will naturally begin optimizing around those metrics as well. And that's where this conversation becomes larger than dual enrollment again. Because modern education increasingly operates within a culture of dashboards, benchmarks, analytics, and measurable outputs. Data has become one of the dominant languages of institutional legitimacy. Schools are expected to demonstrate impact quantitatively. Policymakers want visible returns on investment. Parents want evidence that pathways produce outcomes. And there are real benefits to that shift. Data can expose inequities. It can reveal whether programs actually work. It can help identify students who need additional support. It can prevent institutions from relying entirely on anecdotes or assumptions. But measurement also changes behavior. One of the dangers of any accountability system is that metrics gradually stop being indicators and start becoming goals themselves. The sociologist Donald Campbell once famously observed that the more a quantitative indicator is used for decision-making, the more subject it becomes to corruption pressures, and the more likely it is to distort the very process it was intended to monitor. Education offers endless examples of this phenomenon. A metric becomes a useful tool in its beginning, and over time the metric becomes the target. Eventually, the system reorganizes itself around maximizing the number rather than the deeper purpose. I think that possibility deserves real attention as dual enrollment enters this next stage of development, because some of the most meaningful dimensions of education are extraordinarily difficult to quantify. How do we measure intellectual curiosity? How do we measure confidence, resilience? How do we think about a student discovering a sense of purpose? How do we measure the long-term effect of a mentor who changed the trajectory of a young person's life? Those things matter enormously, yet they rarely fit neatly into dashboards. Even concepts like momentum, while useful, can subtly reshape how we think about students themselves. The language implies forward motion, efficiency, progression, velocity, and again, there's nothing inherently wrong with helping students move successfully through educational systems. But human development is not always linear. Some students accelerate rapidly and thrive. Others need more exploration, more uncertainty, and time to mature intellectually or emotionally. Not every valuable educational experience produces immediate, measurable momentum. Sometimes a course changes how a student sees the world years later. Sometimes failure becomes more formative than immediate success. Sometimes exploration that appears inefficient in the short term becomes transformational in the long term. And those realities are much harder to capture in policy frameworks. And yet, I don't think the answer is to reject metrics altogether. Educational systems need accountability. Public investments deserve evaluation. Families deserve transparency. But the challenge is building systems wise enough to recognize that not everything valuable can be fully reduced to what is easiest to measure. And that may be the biggest tension emerging in this acceleration conversation. The first generation of dual enrollment policy was largely about access. The next generation will be increasingly about accountability, outcomes, and return on investment. And I think that shift is already happening. The question is whether educational leaders can navigate that transition without allowing the language of efficiency and optimization to completely consume the deeper purposes of education itself. Because ultimately, education should produce more than just momentum. It should produce thoughtful, capable, and curious human beings who are not simply prepared to move through systems efficiently, but prepared to live meaningful and intellectually rich lives beyond them. A Slice with Dice is a production of Aldercube. Thanks for making time to reflect with me. If you're finding value in these episodes, I hope you'll subscribe and help spread the word. Until next time, lead boldly, listen closely, and keep pushing forward. I'll see you then.